Welcome to our online video series, Reading Hope in Trying Times. Our guest today is our good friend, the Reverend Carol Howard Merritt. Carol's a minister whose writing, speaking, and teaching is anchored in theological wisdom and sociological insight. She's a sought-after keynote speaker, especially on the topic of ministering in a new generation. After being raised as a conservative Baptist and attending a fundamentalist Bible college, Carol studied at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Texas and became a PCUSA minister. Pastor for almost 2 decades now, Carol served PCUSA churches in the swamps of Cajun, Louisiana, a Bayside village in Rhode Island, an urban neighborhood in Washington, D.C., and in Chattanooga and Connecticut. Carol's the award-winning author of Tribal Church, Ministering to the Missing Generation, and also Reframing Hope, Vital Ministry in a New Generation, and also Healing Spiritual Wounds, Reconnecting with a Loving God After Experiencing a Hurtful Church. Carol's a frequent contributor to books, websites, magazines, and journals, and she's a regular writer on the Christian Century, where her blog is hosted. She's also an adjunct faculty member at Dubuque Theological Seminary and a senior consultant at Center for Progressive Renewal. She co-hosts the thought-provoking podcast God Complex Radio with Reverend Derek Weston. Carol served as a speaker at Writing for Your Life conferences and webinars, and so I'm really glad to have her with us again here today. Welcome, Carol.
It's great to be here. Thank you, Brian, for all that you do for writers and for readers. I really appreciate it.
Well, we're so thankful to have you as part of our extended team. So why don't you tell us a little bit about, kind of how you're feeling these days and how we need to cope with this, what we can do to cope with all of this.
Well, there is just so much going on. It's the news is just overwhelming. So I think I feel like a lot of people, I feel like there's this taut and brittle wire running through my body, and it's just ready to shatter at any moment. And then I have to breathe, and then I, do some stretches, and then I'm okay. But it's just really heartbreaking. You and I are sort of very close to the center of a lot of this, which is in New York City and New York. So it's all become very real here. But then, the snow is falling and it's really beautiful outside, and life is going on, and there's babies being born, and there's beauty in all of it too.
Absolutely. It just makes it a little harder for us to keep our perspective, doesn't it?
Right. Yes, for sure. Especially when you think like each of these numbers isn't a number, right? It's a life, and it's a web of relationships and loved ones, and so then it just becomes so big, it's hard to put our minds around it.
Yes, and there's so much uncertainty in terms of what lies next.
Right, yeah. So I guess we're all in it together. I suppose. Some days I'm angry and at God, and sometimes I'm very hopeful, and sometimes I'm worried and scared. So I'm feeling all of those things.
So let's talk about, kind of like how God has helped you in the past, when you've gone through challenging times. You've certainly written about some of those kinds of things, and, just give us a little bit of insight and help from your past, your perspective.
Yeah. Right now I'm writing a little devotional on Julian and Norwich, and it's been incredibly insightful, super helpful to be reading that right now. It's not a great time to meet a deadline, though. I've had to send a few notes of oh, I'm so sorry. I meant to finish that.
I have another author friend who's in exactly that same position right now. So she asked me to delay our recording for a couple of weeks because she's, heads down.
Right, exactly. And I mean, it would be worse, I think, if, I were trying to come out with a book right now. So at least I'm not in that position. But yeah, so I'm in the middle of writing with Julian of Norwich, and it feels like, she was going through this 700 years ago with the Black Plague. And there's a lot of things I'm uncomfortable with her, because she's like praying for suffering. And I am not like that at all. Like, I reach for the aspirin as soon as I possibly can, and if I feel any pain going on in this body, like I'm trying to get rid of it as quickly as possible. But Julian was actually praying for suffering, and she just has so many beautiful writings about it. And once I finally got over like this aversion to praying for suffering, I started learning from her. And one of the main things she talks about is just what we can learn from suffering. And, she talks about having contrition, having compassion, having a longing for God. And as I'm reading this, I did very much connect with her as she was talking about that, as she was writing about that, just thinking about how all of this results in just some beautiful things in a lot of ways. Again, I don't like suffering, and I don't think it's good, and I'm horrified by it. But at the same time, there's beauty that's coming out of it. I have like these voices in my head from womanist theologians that say, don't glorify suffering, don't glorify suffering. And I absolutely believe that 100%. So I don't want to glorify suffering, but what I do want to do is say that right now and in the past, what has gotten me through difficult times is that sense of being a wounded healer, of being able to have compassion with people because they've gone through the same sorts of suffering. That sense of realizing that suffering brings us to this place where things that matter really matter, right? You're not worried as much about the small things when people are dying. You're worried about calling your mother and telling her that you love her, and making amends with people that you love, and those acts of contrition. And suffering does help me to have this longing for God that I don't always have on an ordinary day-to-day basis. So these words from Julian have definitely been helping me, and definitely been sorting through my writing and echoing through my writing these days.
Well, we can't stop suffering, right?
Right.
But, the question in my mind becomes, okay, well, that's happened. What do we do with it? What do we do about it?
Exactly.
And there was this other conversation that I just had recently where this came up, and it reminded me of this one essay that Frederick Buechner wrote, The Stewardship of Pain. Mm-hmm. And the way that came about was after he talked in front of some audience about, his father's suicide and, the painful things that he had gone through. Mm-hmm. A gentleman came up to him and said, you've been a really good steward of your pain, which was a new concept for him, but he felt like, okay, I need to write about this and think about this.
Yeah.
And, it kind of sounds like, similar to what you were just referring to, that, suffering and pain is not good. We don't wish that on anybody, but it happens. So what do we do with it? What do we do about it? Well, how do we recover? And part of, I think, people's recovery, in the case of a lot of my writer friends, it's writing about it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So you mentioned as part of your research for this book that you're dealing, Julian was dealing with the bubonic plague, going through that whole thing. which obviously centuries ago, travel, communication, technology was so different than it is today. What have you learned or reflected on in terms of that difference and what they had to go through?
Well, that answered a little bit of the question of why she wanted to suffer. Someone, it was on Twitter, a random person on Twitter. If you're listening and you hear this, I apologize that I can't remember your name. But someone said, well, imagine Julian cloistered up in her monastery, looking down on the ground, the people in Norwich and just all of the bodies stacking up. And she wanted to have that feeling of connection, of empathy, it was almost like she couldn't bear to think of Jesus suffering or people suffering without that knowledge herself, because she wanted that compassion and that connection with people. And I just am fascinated by that. And she almost died. She was sick for 3 days. They gave her the last rites. She almost died, and then she had these visions through that experience. And it just makes me, there's just so much comfort in reading these words that they're coming back, and I'm able to hear what she went through on kind of a very mystical level as she was going through this. And much of it was just, she had this sense all throughout this plague that God was surrounding us, like our clothing. God was like our clothing surrounding us. And it was Mother, Father, God is surrounding us as clothing surrounds us and embracing us with love. And then, of course, there was that beautiful saying that she is known for, all shall be well, all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well. And I think the wonderful thing about that is she had both things going on. She had this sense that suffering was real and that she was holding it physically in her body and in her spirit. And at the same time, she had this sense that we all will be well. And in fact, she kind of, when she describes it, it makes me think of when your child, or when my child, who's not a child anymore, you can see her in the background, but when she was little, she would scrape her knee and she would just cry. And I would hold her in my arms, and I would hold her and just go back and forth and pat her and rock her. And there is this sense that that God's that parent. So we are suffering, we are pain, we are hurting, and yet we are still being enveloped by this loving God. There's this loving God that is surrounding it. And so this sense of wellness isn't a sense of, she's not patting us on the head saying, everything's going to be fine. It's more of a sense that every single pain that we go through, all of the suffering that we go through, is going to happen within the loving embrace of God. And I just find that incredibly comforting, especially knowing that she was going through something similar to what's happening here.
So Carol, one of the things that you've written about in some of your books is the whole topic of where is God in all of this. So that, I think, would be a helpful topic to discuss at this point, if you'd like to.
Right. Yeah. I know I talk a lot about this in Healing Spiritual Wounds, because oftentimes when people are hurt by the church or when terrible things happen, and they tend to blame God. And that's very natural, especially if the wound or the hurt has come from the church. And so I try to go and parse that a little bit. And basically what we're dealing with in that situation is this idea for Christians of theodicy. That's the big theological term for it, is theodicy. And there's a sense that God is all loving, that God is all powerful. And then we have this other thing happening, which is that terrible things happen, that there is a coronavirus that's spreading through. So what do we do with those two things? This thought that God is all loving and God is all powerful, and terrible things happen. I think the first thing that we have to do, at least for me, in order to have a healthy, loving faith, is to be able to separate God from the cause. So oftentimes, you might hear people saying that, these horrible things that are happening is God's judgment. It's awful to even think about that. But of course, God doesn't want us to have a cruel and horrible death by the thousands. And so if we can detangle our idea of God from the idea of judgment, or the idea of, that God somehow caused this, and then you start struggling with this idea of, what if God is loving, if God is powerful, then why are these terrible things happening? And it doesn't make sense. And so people have been struggling with this for years and generations. And, it's hard to make sense of that. For me, I need a loving God. I don't necessarily need an all-powerful God. And I believe that God gives us free will. It's not very Presbyterian of me, but I believe that God gives us free will. And I believe that there is this sense of vulnerability that God has. And we see it on the cross, where Jesus is crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And so I just have to believe that our hope lies in the fact that our God is vulnerable, that God suffers with us, that God is walking alongside us and hurting with us, that the only part that God has in all of this is that God is suffering with us. And that's a beautiful, beautiful thing, to be able to crawl into those arms and to be able to cry. It's a lovely thing.
So Carol, in addition to being an author, you're a currently active pastor at a church, which I'm sure leads to some challenges, at this point in time, given everything that's going on. So maybe you could share your perspective on what that's been like, how you've been serving your congregation.
Oh, yeah, there's been a lot of challenges going on right now. And it's been kind of a beautiful time and a difficult time. I keep having to remind myself to relax and to breathe. But generally, we needed to come up with a strategy pretty quickly of how to deal with this crisis. And our congregation has, again, been very close to this crisis. So it's important. It has been important for us to have people on the ground working. So basically what we've been doing is, first we called all of the vulnerable members in the congregation, and we've been asking them what needs they have. if they're able to, making sure that people are able to get to the grocery store, or that they're able to have their groceries delivered. If they don't know how to do that, how we can help them set up doing that. Very quickly, people have either, volunteered to say, I'll go grocery shopping, or they volunteered to call and write notes. So we've had both, people with a lot of needs and people who have been extremely generous with their time and energy. And we've had a lot of tough choices to make. This week we had to close down the AA meeting, and it was just really hard because you're sitting there thinking, what other time do you need an AA meeting more than when you're stuck at home with your family, right? But knowing that it's hard to do the meeting with a limit of 10 people, or whatever the limit is now, and now it is, we're all supposed to be staying home. So there's a lot of like juggling two evils, right? Like which is the worst, like risk management. And so, and then of course, on top of like this heightened pastoral care and trying to be as proactive as possible in calling people and making sure that they're okay, we also had to get all of our services online and trying to figure out how to be able to, I know how to do Zoom, obviously, and I've done podcasts for years, but the sense of like putting everything online and being able to make the music sound beautiful and all of that to work well. And then we got everything online, and then we realized, oh, we still have to pass the plate. Like we don't have any way of passing the plate. We still need those, that additional income coming in, and then rentals have stopped renting space from us. So it's like the problems just keep coming up every day. And so it's just a lot of crisis management in the middle of all of the regular management. In some ways, it's what a lot of businesses are going through right now as they're trying to look at their staff and trying to see what they can do to help their business and to shift quickly into having delivery services instead of dine-in services. We're all just trying to shift and change on a dime. And then on top of that, just trying to send out hopeful and beautiful messages in the midst of this so that people, kind of, I was sending out an ad or a Lenten devotional every day, and I was quoting different people and, pulling different inspirational quotes out. And then I realized this all hit, and people needed to hear from me. So, I began writing prayers and just different things each day. So there's that as well. So there's just so many factors that are going on. Insurance that we need to look into, and people who are just having different jobs, and the tech difficulties of older people trying to get on Zoom. And so it's been a very, very complex, challenging, and in many ways rewarding time, but difficult. And I hope it's ends soon.
I really feel for, pastors, in your guys' situation, because, having to number one, make all the changes, right?
Right.
That you described that are required to move online to the degree that you can, cancel things, change things, whatever, and have an enhanced need for caring for the flock.
Right, right. And
And
then,
and not being able to visit as many people in person is what you normally would want to when you're doing that. So that's a tough combination.
oh, that's the killer, is just knowing that people go into the hospital and you can't visit them. It just, it just tears my heart out, knowing that's going on.
And the whole nursing home population and,
Yes,
other kinds
yes.
of, adult living arrangements.
Right, right. So there's just been a lot to think about. And, on top of that, any sort of anxiety or mental health issues, or, people who are kind of critical become more critical, and people who are, who deal with other issues, everything just sort of heightens in all of this. And um, so it's hard, be gentle with one another.
Yes, yes. So Carol, I just want to thank you so much for joining us. It was really great to have you part of this larger conversation. I'm really glad that people have had a chance to hear from your perspective, both as an author and as a deep thinker and as a pastor. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. And it's an honor to be next to so many amazing, amazing speakers. I was just so impressed when I saw the list. So thank you.
Well, thanks again, Carol, and thanks everyone for joining us.